It was sanctioned by the United States, blacklisted by the European Union, banned by the United Kingdom, and yet it sailed anyway. A Russian oil tanker carrying nearly 750,000 barrels of crude oil cut through international waters, defied Washington's explicit ban, and docked on the shores of Cuba. The world watched, and the United States did nothing. Tonight, we unpack the moment that sent shockwaves through the global order.
The story of how a sanctioned Russian tanker came to deliver oil to Cuba does not begin at sea. It begins in Venezuela. In December 2025, United States military forces intervened in Venezuela, removing President Nicolás Maduro from power. The operation reshaped the political landscape of Latin America overnight. But for Cuba, the immediate consequence was singular and devastating. Its primary oil supply vanished. Venezuela had been Cuba's energy lifeline for years, providing the island nation with heavily subsidized oil under agreements forged during the era of Hugo Chavez. With Maduro gone and Venezuela in political transition, those shipments stopped. Washington moved swiftly to lock in the pressure. In January 2026, Executive Order 14,380 formally established a comprehensive United States energy blockade on Cuba. The order was explicit: no Russian oil, no alternative supply routes, no exceptions. The goal from Washington's perspective was clear: maximum economic pressure on the Cuban government to force political change. What followed, however, was not political change. It was a humanitarian crisis.
For 11 million Cubans, the energy blockade translated into a daily reality that was immediate, painful, and inescapable. Power outages stretched across the island, not for hours, but for entire days at a time. Factories fell silent, businesses shuttered, schools and workplaces operated in uncertainty, never knowing when the next blackout would hit. Inside Cuba's hospitals, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Medical equipment dependent on electricity became unreliable. Staff worked under impossible conditions, rationing supplies, managing reduced capacity, and making decisions no healthcare worker should have to make. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Cuba's infant mortality rate, a key indicator of a nation's healthcare strength, more than doubled between 2018 and 2026, rising from 4 deaths per 1,000 live births to 10. Behind every one of those numbers is a family, a mother, a child who did not survive. When news spread that an oil tanker was approaching Cuban waters, the reaction among ordinary Cubans was not political. It was relief, raw, exhausted, and long overdue.
The United States has long defended its Cuba policy on moral and democratic grounds. The argument from Washington is straightforward. The Cuban government has, for decades, suppressed political opposition, jailed dissidents, and denied its citizens basic freedoms. Economic pressure, the argument goes, is a legitimate, even necessary, tool to push Havana toward reform. And in one measure, the blockade appeared to work. During diplomatic negotiations, Cuba released 51 political prisoners. Later, more than 2,000 more were freed, a significant concession that Washington pointed to as evidence that sustained pressure yields results.
But that argument has a powerful counter. Critics, including international human rights organizations, Latin American governments, and humanitarian agencies, pointed directly to the infant mortality figures, to the hospital blackouts, to the factory shutdowns that left working families without income. Their argument: when sanctions cause preventable deaths among civilians, the moral foundation of the policy collapses. Economic warfare, they contend, cannot be separated from its human consequences. And then there is the strategic dimension, which, for many observers, proved to be the most damaging failure of all. The blockade was designed to isolate Cuba. Instead, it handed Russia a stage.
Not all of this story unfolded in the open. Before the Anatoly Kolodkin made its high-profile approach to Cuban waters, another vessel had already made the journey, quietly, carefully, and under the cover of deliberate deception. The Seahorse, a Hong Kong-flagged tanker, was carrying between 190,000 and 200,000 barrels of Russian diesel. To avoid detection, its crew took extraordinary measures. They switched off the vessel's AIS transponder, the automatic identification system that allows maritime authorities and satellite trackers to monitor ship movements in real time. They broadcast false destination data, pointing observers in the wrong direction. In short, they went dark and they lied about where they were going.
That a civilian cargo vessel had to operate like a covert operation simply to deliver fuel to a population in need speaks to the extraordinary pressure surrounding this crisis. The Seahorse made it. Its diesel reached Cuba. Its story remained largely invisible until it was already done. It was a preview of what was coming next. Only this time, the world would be watching.
Russia's decision to intervene openly was not impulsive. It was calculated, and the language Moscow chose to frame it was deliberate. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov announced that Russia was ready to provide all possible assistance to Cuba. Energy Minister Sergei Tsivilev confirmed the oil shipment would be sent as, and this word choice matters, humanitarian aid. By calling it humanitarian, Russia achieved several strategic objectives simultaneously. It positioned itself as a protector of a suffering civilian population against American aggression. It challenged the moral legitimacy of the blockade on the global stage, and it dared Washington to enforce its own executive order against a nuclear-armed power. Then came the moment that stunned observers on both sides of the debate. President Donald Trump, the same president whose administration had issued Executive Order 14,380, stated publicly, and without significant qualification, that he had no problem with Russia sending oil to Cuba. In those few words, the enforcement architecture of the blockade effectively collapsed. The Anatoly Kolodkin, sanctioned by the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, was given, in practical terms, a presidential pass. On March 31, 2026, it docked at the port of Matanzas, Cuba. 730,000 barrels of crude oil were delivered. Analysts estimated that quantity was sufficient to cover Cuba's energy demands for approximately 12.5 days. It was the first successful oil delivery to Cuba in 3 months.
Zoom out from the port of Matanzas, and the implications of this moment extend far beyond Cuba, or even Russia and the United States. For the first time in living memory, a major global power directly and openly challenged an American-imposed blockade in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine, the 2-century-old principle asserting United States dominance in the Americas, was tested not in rhetoric, but in action, and the challenge was not met. Analysts have pointed to a constellation of factors that explain, though do not excuse, Washington's hesitation. American military resources are currently stretched across multiple simultaneous commitments: the intervention in Venezuela, ongoing obligations in other theaters, the practical limits of projecting decisive power in several directions at once.
Russia read that landscape, and it moved. The signal received in capitals around the world was unmistakable. If the United States will not enforce its own sanctions in its own backyard against a vessel it has blacklisted, carrying cargo it has explicitly banned, headed to a destination it has blockaded, what does that say about the credibility of American deterrence elsewhere? For allies who depend on Washington's commitments, the question is uncomfortable. For adversaries watching for openings, the answer may be instructive. Meanwhile, Cuba's parallel diplomatic maneuvering added a further layer of complexity. The release of political prisoners, offered as goodwill gestures during negotiations, demonstrated that Havana is not without strategic agency. The Cuban government accepted Russia's lifeline while simultaneously making limited concessions to reduce diplomatic pressure from Washington. It was a careful dual-track strategy, and for now, it appears to have worked.
A sanctioned tanker, 730,000 barrels of oil, 12.5 days of power for a nation on the edge. On the surface, this is a story about energy and economics, but beneath it runs a deeper current, about the limits of sanctions as a tool of foreign policy, about the human cost of geopolitical competition, and about what happens when the resolve behind a policy does not match the rhetoric used to defend it. Cuba has not been saved. 12.5 days of fuel is not a solution to a structural energy crisis. The political tensions between Havana and Washington remain unresolved, and the underlying question of governance and human rights on the island has not moved meaningfully closer to an answer. But something fundamental has shifted in how this story will be told and remembered. Russia demonstrated that it can challenge American authority in the Western Hemisphere openly, successfully, and without consequence. Cuba demonstrated that even under extreme pressure, it retains the ability to maneuver diplomatically and survive strategically. And the United States was confronted, publicly and on the record, with the gap between its stated policy and its actual capacity to enforce it. The blockade may still be in place on paper, but its credibility, and the credibility of the power behind it, will take far longer to rebuild than it took to shatter. In a world watching closely for signs of what comes next, that distinction may prove to be the most consequential development of all. This is your news update. Stay informed, stay engaged.